The shriek of buckling alloy thundered through the doomed battlecruiser, rattling every bone in Mason's body as he pressed himself against the trembling bulkhead. Sparks spat from torn seams in the hull, and the distant groan of tortured metal echoed down the corridor, as if the ship itself mourned its fate. Mason's ears rang, his blood humming with a cocktail of fear and adrenaline. The war was over. He felt the finality in his marrow, in the way the emergency lights flickered and died, leaving only the crimson pulse of warning strobes. This vessel, once his sanctuary, was now a crypt adrift in the void. Silence fell, dense and absolute, broken only by the erratic hum of failing life support. Then, a new sound slashed through the quiet, the sizzle of a fusion cutter biting through the outer hatch. Blinding white fire arced through the seams, molten metal dripping like tears. Mason's heart pounded. He wiped blood from his brow, fingers trembling as he pressed himself tighter to the wall. Boots thundered on deck plates. The hatch crashed inward with a dull boom, and shadows spilled into the corridor. The Jaran boarding party entered in a disciplined wedge, a wall of armored muscle and predatory intent. Their slate-blue hides gleamed beneath ceremonial harnesses, every movement fluid with the confidence of conquerors. At their head strode the captain, taller than the rest, his face a mosaic of scars like shattered glass. His eyes swept the ruin with cold precision before he barked an order in a guttural tongue. The squad surged forward. Mason sprang from his cover, desperate, launching himself at the nearest Jaran. His fists landed, bone and knuckle against alien armor. It was a hopeless struggle. Their strength dwarfed his own. Their formation was a living fortress. He fought anyway, driven by the primal need to resist, to make every second count. His resistance was brief but fierce, a flurry of motion and pain, elbows and knees, until rough hands seized him, pinning his limbs. Shackles clamped around his wrists and ankles, biting cold into his skin. He was dragged through the corridors of his fallen ship, past torn banners and shattered screens, past Jaran warriors who jeered at the battered human. Mason caught glimpses of other prisoners, some cowering, some already dead. He set his jaw, refusing to show fear. They marched him deeper, through an airlock, and into a hall that stole the breath from his lungs. Midnight stone glimmered beneath his boots, the floor veined with streaks of silver that caught the light from a swirling dome of artificial stars above. The ceiling was impossibly high, the space filled with a cool, humming energy. At the far end, atop a dais fashioned from salvaged command consoles, sat Empress Lyrael. She was a vision of alien grace, her skin a translucent pale blue that shimmered with each flicker of emotion. High cheekbones and a delicate jaw lent her an ethereal beauty, but it was her eyes that commanded all attention, piercing violet, alive with intelligence and something ancient. She wore a gown of spun crystal and shadow, and around her stood courtiers in elaborate harnesses, silent and watchful. Mason was forced to his knees, the chain at his wrist yanked by a guard. He glared up, defiant, meeting Lyrael's gaze. "A human," Lyrael mused, her voice melodic and edged with steel. It carried across the hall, soft but inarguable, every syllable shaped with intent. "The last of his kind aboard this wreck. They burn so brightly when cornered." She rose, descending the dais with measured steps, her presence drawing the attention of all. The court seemed to hold its breath. Lyrael stopped before Mason, so close he could see the faint web of veins beneath her skin, the subtle chill radiating from her. The scent of ozone and distant rain drifted from her, strange and inviting. The captain stepped forward and bowed his head. "He has not spoken, Empress. Stubborn, this one." Lyrael did not look away from Mason. She waved a slender hand in dismissal. "Stubbornness is a virtue in a survivor, or a champion." Her eyes searched his, and Mason saw not cruelty, but curiosity, dangerous in its own right. She knelt, bringing herself to his level. "What is your name, human?" Mason clenched his jaw, saying nothing. The silence stretched. The courtiers whispered among themselves, and the captain's mouth twisted in irritation. Lirael's lips curved in a slow, predatory smile. I will not have you executed, human. That would be a waste of spirit. You will fight in my Colosseum. You will bleed for the amusement of my court. You will be my champion. She straightened, her gaze never leaving his. And you will wear my mark. He was hauled away, through a labyrinth of corridors that smelled of metal and incense, and then shoved through a gate into the arena. The pit was a vast depression floored with indigo sand, stained here and there with old blood. The stands loomed above, filled with Jaran nobles and soldiers, their voices a low, hungry buzz. The air vibrated with anticipation. A grizzled pitmaster awaited him, one cybernetic arm gleaming in the harsh lights. He eyed Mason up and down, his face unreadable. The Empress wishes to see what you're made of. He shoved Mason forward, into the ring. Warriors filed in. Jaran brutes twice his size, their bodies armored in living carapace and bone. The gates slammed shut. Mason felt the eyes of the court upon him, felt the Empress's gaze as a tangible weight. A horn blared. The Jarans advanced, confident, moving as a single wall of muscle and bone. Mason darted to the side, sand kicking up behind him. He ducked a sweeping blow, rolled beneath another, and jabbed an elbow into a knee joint. It barely fazed the giant, but Mason was already gone, weaving, dodging, searching for weaknesses. Every moment was a lesson, how they moved, how they telegraphed their attacks, where their armor left vulnerable seams. He landed a punch to a throat, danced away from a crushing fist, slid beneath a grappling arm. Pain flared as a boot caught his ribs, but he twisted, using the momentum to trip another opponent. The crowd's roar swelled and dipped with each exchange. Mason's knuckles bled, his breath came ragged, but he endured. High above, Lirael watched from her balcony, her interest sharpening with each round. The captain stood beside her, scowling. He fights like a rodent, quick but dishonorable. There is wisdom in survival, Lirael replied, her violet eyes never wavering from Mason. That is a different sort of honor. Mason did not win, but he did not die. Battered and bruised, he survived the day, and the next, and the next. Each bout, he adapted, learned more, how to use the sand, how to let his opponent's weight work against them. Armed with a practice blade, he learned to turn an enemy's momentum into his own. In the darkness of his cell, he studied every detail, the rituals before battle, the murals carved into the stone, the subtle gestures exchanged among the Jaran. The arena became another battlefield, the court another army to outwit. But resentment festered. The captain watched the Empress's growing interest with a sour glare. He whispered to the nobles, his words dripping with contempt. She dotes on the human. Our traditions are mocked. The seeds of unrest took root, invisible but potent. On the 8th night, as Mason rested in his cell, the clang of armored boots drew near. 2 guards entered, their faces impassive. Without a word, they unlocked his shackles and led him from the darkness, not toward the arena's gate, but deeper into the palace, through winding halls hung with strange banners. They stopped before a door inlaid with luminous crystal. The guards stepped aside. Mason stared at the threshold, heart pounding, sensing a new trial awaited. The door slid open, spilling cool blue light across his battered frame. The guards gestured for him to enter, and he stepped forward into Empress Lirael's private sanctum. Lirael's quarters were a world apart, warm, perfumed air, translucent drapes that drifted like ghosts in the artificial breeze, and a panoramic view of nebula swirling beyond seamless crystal. A faint, haunting melody shimmered from hidden speakers, mingling with the scent of something floral and sharp, alien, but strangely inviting. Mason paused just inside the threshold, jaw set, battered body taut as a drawn wire. The violence and clamor of the arena seemed impossibly distant here. Empress Lirael stood at the center of this sanctuary, unarmored and unguarded. She wore a flowing midnight robe that fell in liquid folds around her pale blue skin glowing softly in the low light. The robe's collar swept high, framing her aristocratic features and accentuating the ethereal line of her neck. Every motion was deliberate, each breath a calculated mystery. Her eyes, luminous and violet, settled on him with cool appraisal. "Leave us," she commanded, her voice silk over steel. The guards withdrew, doors sealing with a whisper so soft it might have been imagined. Mason straightened, gaze sweeping the room, cataloging exits, shadows, anything that might matter. His wrist still bore the impressions of shackles, but the man himself was unbowed. He let his eyes linger on her a moment before he spoke. "You fight like a scavenger, not a soldier," Lyrael said, circling him, her bare feet silent on the heated stone floor. "A scavenger survives," Mason replied, voice roughened by recent wounds and older losses. "A soldier dies for a cause. I choose survival." She regarded him with faint amusement, a glimmer flickering in her eyes. "You adapt quickly. That is rare among your kind." "You've been listening to your captain," Mason observed, following her with a wary, sidelong glance. "He sees only what he expects. The universe is not so simple." Lyrael paused in front of him, head tilting, the pale curve of her mouth unreadable. "And what are you, then?" "I'm human. We change, or we perish," Mason said simply. "Your captain has only ever known how to crush." Her expression sharpened, the line of her jaw tensing. "You speak boldly for a prisoner." He shrugged, letting his shackled wrists drop to his sides. "The chains fell away in the arena. This," he gestured to the draped luxury, the endless cosmos outside, "is something else." Silence hung between them, taut and electric. Here, in the charged hush of her sanctum, the old boundaries shifted. She was his captor by law and custom, but here she watched him with the wary regard of an equal measuring a worthy adversary. Lyrael drifted closer, her presence cool as starlight. "Tomorrow is the marking ceremony," she said softly. "Before the court, I will claim you. You will kneel and accept it. You will belong to me." "Will I?" Mason's tone was steel-wrapped in velvet, a challenge and a promise. He did not flinch beneath her gaze. The distance between them was measured in heartbeats, not meters. Her lips parted, but she said nothing more. Mason saw a flicker of uncertainty, a chink in her imperious armor. Then, with a gesture sharp as a blade, she turned and vanished into the next chamber, leaving him alone with the scent of distant storms. The night passed in a series of restless dreams and silent calculations. Mason replayed every word, every gesture, mapping the possibilities, the traps and opportunities. He was not sure what game Lyrael meant to play, but he was determined not to lose. Dawn, such as it was aboard a starbound palace, arrived in a flurry of ritual and expectation. The Grand Colosseum, carved from obsidian and starlight, overflowed with Jaran aristocrats in dazzling harnesses, their voices a susurrus of intrigue. Columns spiraled to impossible heights, crowned with banners that shimmered like liquid night. Mason stood at the center of the arena, bare-chested, every old scar and new bruise a testament to his survival. His skin was slick with the dew of anticipation, but his eyes never wavered. He scanned the tiers, faces sharp with curiosity, malice, and something that might almost have been hope. His hands, unshackled, rested calmly at his sides. A horn sounded, low and resonant. The crowd fell silent. Empress Lyrael entered, resplendent in ceremonial regalia that blazed beneath the dome. Her robe had been replaced by a mantle of woven crystal, and a crown of crystalline shards adorned her brow. She moved with impossible grace, every step watched, every movement calculated to project power and poise. Behind her walked the captain, armored and alert, and the ritualist, a stooped figure in robes of deepest violet. The ritualist carried a narrow case, which he opened with reverent care, revealing the champion's torque, a band of dark alloy set with a single stone that glowed with an inner, unsteady light. Lyrael ascended the dais overlooking the arena, gaze fixed upon Mason. She lifted her chin, voice ringing with command. "Kneel, human." Mason did not move. His eyes locked on hers, defiant, his every muscle tense with refusal. A ripple of shock passed through the court, 1,000 whispered doubts flickering like sparks. The captain's hand hovered over his weapon, knuckles whitening around the hilt. Mason drew a slow breath. "By the ancient laws of the first Empress," he intoned, his voice carrying across the marble and sand, "a gift of loyalty can only be accepted if the one who claims it is found worthy." For a heartbeat there was only silence, a vacuum of disbelief. Then, a collective gasp as the court recognized the forgotten right Mason had invoked. The ritualist's hands trembled. The captain glared, murder in his eyes. Lyrael hesitated, the moment stretching. Mason's stance shifted subtly, alert, balanced, dangerous. In the blink of an eye he moved, swift and precise. He darted past the guards flanking him, disabling them with calculated blows, never striking to kill. One fell to his knees, the other gasped for breath. The crowd erupted in a confusion of shouts and hisses. But Mason did not threaten Lyrael. He advanced, torque in hand, and met her eyes, searching, asking. She stood unflinching as he reached her, every muscle in her body poised for either violence or surrender. With deliberate care, Mason lifted the torque, weighed its significance in his palm, and then, eyes locked on hers, placed it gently around her slender neck. The stone set at the center flared with violet light, then calmed, pulsing softly in the hollow of her throat. A stunned hush fell across the arena. For a long moment, no one breathed. He had marked the Empress before her entire court. Chaos erupted. Nobles shouted, fists shook. The captain roared, weapon drawn and eyes wild with fury. Before he could advance, Lyrael lifted her hand, a single sharp gesture, and the arena fell silent again. Her voice, when it came, was thunder edged with glass. "Enough!" The captain froze, his blade half drawn, fury and confusion warring in his glare. The ritualist, his robes trembling, stepped forward. "The right is fulfilled. The ancient law is satisfied." Gasps rippled through the audience, the scandal clear in every hissed breath. For one reckless, ungoverned moment, Mason and Lyrael stood at the center of the world, bound by ritual, watched by a civilization that measured worth in power and spectacle. Lyrael's anger burned in her violet eyes, but there was something else. A grudging respect, edged with something Mason could not yet name. She straightened, voice cool but unyielding. "He will remain under my personal supervision," she declared, sweeping her gaze across the stunned nobles, "to ensure his continued service to the realm." The court buzzed with scandal and awe, the implications of the act ricocheting through the tears. Mason allowed himself a breath, his shoulders relaxing only a fraction as the guards closed in. As he was led away, he met Lyrael's gaze, saw the flicker of challenge, the hint of a smile, the promise that their contest was far from over. The game had changed, and neither of them intended to lose. The imperial suite was a haven of starlit alcoves and soft tapestries, its ceilings aglow with drifting constellations rendered in shifting light. The room was vast, but felt close, the air charged with the crackle of new power dynamics. Mason paced the inlaid floor, each step echoing with the knowledge that he was no longer a mere prisoner, yet not free. A guest in a gilded cage, watched by invisible eyes, his every movement weighted with consequence. The torque at Lyrael's throat, dark alloy pulsing with violet light, was both a mark of humiliation and a bond invisible yet unbreakable. Outside the glass walls, nebulae drifted past in unhurried spirals, painting the room with molten gold and ghostly blue. But Mason's gaze returned always to the door, his body still coiled with wariness, never forgetting that here, safety and danger wore the same face. The door sighed open. Lirael entered, dressed simply, a tunic of soft, dusk-hued fabric, bare feet on the cool stone, the torque stark and heavy against her pale blue skin. Her hair, usually bound in elaborate braids, fell loose to her shoulders. There was no court now, no audience, only the silence between them. "Why?" she demanded, voice low and sharp as cut glass. "Why risk everything?" Mason stopped his pacing, facing her squarely. "Death in the arena was certain," he replied, his voice rough but steady. "Better a swift end than a slow one as your plaything. I changed the rules. You made me a spectacle. I made you a legend. Your court is unsettled. Now they are captivated." Her eyes narrowed. She stepped closer, studying him as if searching for a crack in his armor. "You think you understand my people. You know nothing of the Jaren." Mason shook his head, unflinching. "I understand power, and I understand you. You're tired of your captain's brutality." A flicker of pain crossed her face, so brief he would have missed it, had he not been looking. She couldn't refute it. Instead, her fingers drifted to the torque at her throat, tracing the glowing stone as if to remind herself it was real. "The law says only the one who placed it can remove it, after a demonstration of absolute loyalty, or upon death." Mason's gaze locked with hers, the weight of the bond settling between them. "We're bound together," he said softly. The truth of it thrummed in the silence, deeper than iron or law. For a long moment, neither moved. Then, as if a wordless accord had been struck, they parted, each lost in thought, each measuring the other anew. Days unfolded in a wary rhythm, shaped by the necessity of proximity and the impossibility of trust. They shared meals at a long table carved from obsidian and star metal, the nebulae beyond the windows casting their faces in shifting prismatic light. Lyrael spoke little, but when she did, her words were careful, deliberate, always testing the boundaries of their alliance. Mason, in turn, watched her with an intensity that unsettled even the Empress. The captain's campaign against Mason did not abate. If anything, it grew more ferocious. Rumors slithered through the court, accusations of seduction, of witchcraft, of betrayal. The nobles grew restless, their anxiety simmering beneath each formal greeting and veiled slight. Lirael dismissed the captain from her private councils, but his shadow lingered, an unspoken threat that neither of them could ignore. One evening, with the palace quiet and the only sound the distant hum of the ship's engines, Lirael found Mason standing by a star map projected onto the glass wall. Colored points glimmered in the darkness, tracing the spiral arms of the galaxy. He traced a finger along the outer rim, expression distant, haunted. "Searching for home?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended. He didn't turn. "It's gone," he said quietly. "Your archives say my system was lost to a nova centuries ago. I may be the last." His shoulders sagged, but he did not cry, his grief worn smooth by time and distance. "We were already memories." A surge of empathy struck Lirael, sharp and unexpected. She stepped closer, close enough to sense the heat of his body, her hand reaching out before she caught herself. She let it fall to her side. "The captain says I should have you executed," she said, masking the tremor in her voice with formality. "He's not wrong. I am a liability, but not for the reasons he thinks." Mason turned, and in his eyes she saw not fear, but understanding. "You can't control the court with fear forever," he murmured. "Sooner or later, they turn it on you." Before she could answer, a sharp, silent alarm pulsed, a violet light at the edge of her vision, so faint only those trained to notice would have seen it. Instincts honed by battle and intrigue took over. Lirael drew a concealed blade from the folds of her robe, while Mason's eyes darted to the source of the breach. Panels slid open along the wall. Masked figures poured into the suite, armored in midnight plating, weapons drawn. Assassins, Jaren, but moving with an efficiency that spoke of military discipline. The captain's doing. It could be no other. Mason moved first, pulling Lyrael behind a low table just as plasma bolts seared the air where she had stood. He flung himself into the fray, a blur of motion, ducking, weaving, disabling attackers with ruthless precision. His fists found pressure points, his feet swept legs from beneath armored bodies. One assassin lunged for Lyrael, but Mason intercepted, wrenching the weapon away and sending the assailant crashing into a tapestry. Lyrael fought too, her blade a flash of silver, her movements a dance of lethal grace. She dispatched one, then another, the torque at her throat glimmering with every exertion. The suite was chaos, furniture shattered, smoke curling from singed silk, the nebulae beyond casting everything in surreal color. Mason took a glancing blow to the shoulder, grunted, spun, and drove his knee into an attacker's midsection. Lyrael caught his eye, no longer Empress and captive, but comrades in survival. The last assassin lunged at Mason, blade raised. Lyrael swept in, dispatching the attacker with a swift, merciless stroke. Silence fell, the bodies cooling on the mosaic floor, the air thick with scorched ozone. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. The sound of their ragged breathing filled the starlit hush. Lyrael crossed to Mason, dropping her blade. Blood welled from a cut on his arm. She knelt, tearing a strip from her sleeve and pressing it to the wound. Her touch was gentle, lingering, her face close enough that he could see the flecks of silver in her violet eyes. He caught her hand, holding it between his own, warm, calloused, trembling slightly. Their gazes met, unguarded. "You saved me," she whispered, the words heavy with revelation. She had never said them before, not to anyone. Mason's lips quirked, his voice rough but intimate. It was necessary. But his eyes said more. They held gratitude and a yearning he could no longer mask. Lyrael's breath hitched, and her fingers tightened around his. The distance between them evaporated, replaced by something urgent and fragile. Their lips met, first tentative, then urgent and searching. The kiss was a collision of longing and relief, the crackle of adrenaline transmuting into something deeper. Mason lifted her easily, carrying her through the wreckage to the bed at the heart of the suite, its canopy a cascade of stars. Beneath that shifting light, their bodies entwined, barriers falling away. The torque at Lyrael's throat pressed cool against Mason's skin as they moved together, passion forging a new alliance, more binding than ritual or law. In the hush that followed, the balance between them had shifted, no longer ruler and captive, but partners, bound by choice and circumstance, their future as uncertain and beautiful as the stars. In the days that followed, their partnership deepened. By day, Empress and champion. By night, lovers and conspirators. The boundaries between them had dissolved, replaced by something fierce and unspoken. Each morning, Lyrael summoned Mason to her side, at council, at inspection, at ceremonial feasts. The torque at her throat glimmered beneath her collar, no longer a mark of humiliation, but of alliance. At night, their whispers mingled in the dark, breaths tangling as they traced the lines of battle and the contours of each other's hopes. Mason's human insight became Lyrael's secret strength. "The captain expects a direct challenge," he murmured one evening, their bodies curled together in the starlit alcove. "Let him believe he's outsmarted you. Let him betray himself." Lyrael's lips brushed his shoulder, a smile ghosting across her face. "He thinks me soft for loving you. He forgets that mercy can be a blade." They mapped their enemy's mind, laying psychological snares as deftly as soldiers laid mines. Lyrael, with her command of resources and subtlety, provided the levers of power, encrypted communiques, misplaced orders, carefully selected confidants. Mason charted the strategy, a web of misdirection and false leads that spread through the palace like a silent contagion. They orchestrated whispered rumors and intercepted messages, setting the court on edge, making it impossible for the captain to tell friend from foe. Planning sessions blurred into hours spent pressed together, over datapads, over one another, over the ancient game of survival and trust. The torque, once cold and alien, had become a talisman, a symbol of their shared power and the intimacy that threaded through every glance and touch. One evening, as a comet streaked past the viewing port, casting the suite in a fleeting wash of silver fire, Lyrael lay beside Mason, her hand tracing the constellation of scars across his chest. Silence settled, comfortable and rare. "You never told me your name," she said softly, her violet eyes luminous in the half-light. He turned his head, the ghost of a smile playing at his lips. "Mason," he replied, the syllables a promise and a memory. He watched her as though seeing her for the first time, the Empress and the woman, power and vulnerability entwined. Lyrael hesitated, searching his face. "When this is over, what becomes of us?" Mason's smile deepened, hope flickering in his eyes. "We stop playing their game," he said quietly. "We make our own." She rested her forehead to his, their breaths mingling, a vow spoken without words. The trap was set. Weeks of careful maneuvering brought the palace to the edge of upheaval. The captain, convinced that Lyrael would dissolve the council and seize absolute power, marshaled his supporters. The empire braced for conflict, the tension so thick it felt like a gathering storm pressing against the palace walls. On the appointed day, the grand Colosseum filled to bursting. Nobles jostled for position beneath soaring arches of obsidian and crystal, their voices sharp with anticipation and dread. The banners of every house hung motionless, as if the very air awaited the outcome. Lyrael stood on the dais, radiant in battle regalia, silver and indigo-scaled armor that caught the light with every breath. The torque still circled her neck, its stone aglow. Mason stood at her side, his bearing calm, his eyes scanning every shadow for danger. The captain strode to the center of the arena, flanked by armored loyalists. His face was a mask of righteous fury, but Mason saw the tremor in his hands, the sweat beading along his brow. "Empress Lyrael," the captain's voice thundered, echoing across the stone. "You have betrayed the legacy of the first Empress. You have sullied our honor by consorting with the human, inviting weakness and disorder. I demand your abdication. The council will not be dissolved by your decree." The court erupted in anxious whispers. Lyrael stood unflinching, her eyes cold as the heart of a nova. "You who sent assassins to my chambers?" she said, her words slicing through the noise like a blade. "You who conspired to kill your sovereign in the dark?" The captain's jaw tightened. "Lies! You have no proof, only the word of your human consort. Who here will trust the last of a lost species?" Before Lyrael could answer, Mason stepped forward, his voice calm but carrying to every corner of the Colosseum. "The Jaren value honor," he said, his accent harsh but steady. "But honor is not blind obedience. It is truth. It is courage, even when it threatens those in power." He paced before the gathered council, holding the attention of every noble, every soldier. "I have gathered evidence," he continued. "Encrypted messages intercepted from the captain's own hand, orders to his private guard, accounts from servants who saw the assassins enter the Empress's wing." He gestured to the ritualist, who stepped forward with a datapad, the council's crest blazing on its surface. The captain's composure faltered. "You would take the word of a human." "Enough," Mason said, his voice ringing out. "You speak of loyalty, but you would spill your Empress's blood. The law is clear. To accuse the sovereign is to bear the burden of proof. I call for the right of reckoning." A hush fell. The oldest noble in the council nodded gravely. "The right is ancient law. Will the captain submit?" The captain's eyes darted to his remaining allies, too few and shrinking. In desperation, he lunged, drawing his blade and hurtling toward Lariel. But Mason was ready. He moved with preternatural speed, intercepting the captain in a blur of motion. The captain's blade sang through the air, but Mason caught his wrist, twisted, and dropped him to his knees with a decisive, elegant blow. The blade clattered across the stone. The court gasped. Liriel's eyes shone with pride and relief. The captain sagged in Mason's grasp, beaten and exposed. The coup collapsed in an instant. The captain's supporters were seized by palace guards, their badges of office stripped away. The oldest noble pronounced judgment: exile to the outer colonies, titles and privilege revoked. The captain was dragged from the chamber, his fate sealed. Liriel stood tall on the dais, Mason at her side. The court bowed low, not merely in submission, but in awe. Rumors would spread. The Empress, wise and merciful, had outwitted a traitor and claimed a human champion whose cunning rivaled the legends of old. In the quiet that followed, the Colosseum emptied. Liriel and Mason retreated to the throne room, its vaulted ceilings echoing with memory. Sunlight from 1,000 distant stars poured through crystal windows, painting the space in shifting hues. Liriel stood before her throne, shoulders squared, her face softening as Mason approached. He reached up, fingers trembling slightly, and removed the torque from her neck. The act was gentle, reverent, a severing of the old bond, not of love, but of submission. He knelt, offering the torque up to her as a pledge, not of fealty, but of partnership. "By my will and by my heart," he said quietly, "I return this to you, not as a chain, but as a promise." Liriel's hands closed over his. She lifted the torque, her gaze fierce and tender. With deliberate care, she placed it around his neck, sealing a new bond, one forged not by necessity, but by choice. They rose together, champion and sovereign, consort and ruler, bound now by trust, by shared victory, and by a love that had remade the stars. 5 years passed. The throne hall softened, Terran plants thriving in the once sterile alcoves, a testament to Mason's influence. Vines of blue morning glory coiled around crystalline columns, and pots of silver-leaf ferns lined the walkways, their dew-sparkled fronds brushing the boots of courtiers who once might have scorned such alien beauty. Sunlight from 1,000 distant stars spilled through the arched windows, dappling the mosaic floor with shifting patterns of green and gold. The air held a faint sweetness, carrying the memory of Earth across light years. Liriel sat on her throne, posture regal, her presence as commanding as ever. The torque was gone from her neck, but its meaning lingered, a bond now lived, not worn. Her pale blue skin caught the starlight, her eyes wise and bright. Mason sat beside her, no longer behind or below, but as an equal. The torque circled his throat, the stone at its center pulsing with tranquil violet light, a living reminder of the journey that had brought them here. Before the dais, a delegation from the Turnus coalition knelt, cloaks pooling on the floor. Their envoy, a tall, gold-skinned woman with intricate facial tattoos, rose and addressed the throne, voice ringing with the weight of old tradition. She recited ancient codes, her words both a plea and a challenge, framing the dispute over the gas world halos in terms of sovereignty and honor. The old Liriel might have dismissed them, wielding authority like a blade, but now she listened, hands resting lightly on the throne, expression thoughtful and open. She waited until the envoy's final phrase echoed into silence, then glanced to Mason. Mason stood, moving with the quiet confidence of one who had earned both scars and respect. His eyes found the envoy's, his voice carrying through the hall with calm resolve. "Envoy, your claim is old, but your stewardship is lacking. Halos' instability and coming threats demand more than treaties." He paused, letting his words settle. "We have watched your orbital platforms falter. Your mining crews risk disaster as the planet's storms worsen. The Jaren have resources and experience with such worlds. We propose an alliance. Jaren fleets will fortify halos, repairing your platforms and safeguarding your people. In return, the coalition will share Halos' bounty, resources, technology, and access to the outer rings. The envoy hesitated, caught off guard by the offer, pragmatic, generous, and impossible to refuse without looking small. We will consider your offer, she managed, bowing her head. The court murmured approval. Some glared, tradition stinging. Others nodded, seeing the wisdom in adaptation. When the delegation withdrew and the courtiers drifted away, the hall grew quiet, the air filled with the afterglow of victory and change. Lirael's hand found Mason's as she descended the dais. She drew him close, her lips meeting his in a kiss that was now a union, not a contest. The tension of the day fell away. The world shrank to the warmth between them, to the memory of all they had survived. For a moment, they were simply two people, not rulers or legends. Later, in their private chambers, intimacy bloomed in the hush. The suite was alive with the hum of plant life and the soft glow of nebulae through the windows. Lirael ran her fingers along Mason's chest, tracing the map of old wounds and new peace. Their conversation drifted from the trivial to the profound, weaving together memories of war and dreams of peace. "Do you remember the first time you stood in this hall?" Lirael asked quietly, her head resting on his shoulder. "I remember the cold," Mason replied, a smile curving his lips. "And the way you watched me, like I was both a puzzle and a threat." She laughed, the sound softer than any courtly music. "You were both. You still are." They shared a quiet meal, tasting fruits and breads from both their worlds. Mason watched her as she poured wine, her gestures graceful, assured. In these small rituals, their partnership felt most real, most lasting. Lirael set her cup aside, her gaze suddenly distant. "The ritualist spoke to me this morning," she said. "She worries about succession. The old houses wonder what would happen if we had a child." Her words were gentle, but the question in them was sharp, honed by years of avoidance. Mason fell silent, his brow furrowed. This was the conversation that had loomed, unspoken, over every night they had shared. For a long moment, he simply looked at her, searching her face for fear, for doubt, for hope. Lirael took his hand and placed it gently on her abdomen, her own fingers resting atop his. Her skin was warm, her eyes steady. "Our future is ours to build," she said, her voice unwavering. The meaning was clear: a hybrid child, a symbol of their unity, a bridge between worlds. Mason's expression softened, the lines of worry easing as understanding dawned. His smile, when it came, was pure joy, raw and unguarded, a boyish lightness returning to his battle-hardened features. "So be it," he whispered, echoing the old Jaren law that had once changed their destinies. His words were not just assent, but a vow. Lirael kissed him, sealing the promise with tenderness and certainty. In that embrace, the future opened before them, uncertain, yes, but theirs to shape. A union forged not in conquest or tradition, but in choice. And as the stars wheeled silently beyond their window, ruler and champion lay together, building a legacy in the quiet between heartbeats, ready at last to begin. The Jaren dominion, once defined by conquest and custom, had changed. The old emblems of war, the banners, the oaths, the echoing halls built for intimidation, remained, but their meaning was transformed. The sharp clang of boots on obsidian had softened. Laughter and debate now filled spaces once reserved for command. Words spread on the solar winds, whispered in outposts and broadcast in the great forums of allied worlds. The Empress's consort was human, her throne shared by wit as much as might. The young took note, their elders debated, and distant systems watched as Jaran tradition bent to something new. Where once the palace gardens were barren, now Terran and alien flora flourished side by side. Vines of wild jasmine wove through the silver-barked chalel trees, their blossoms perfuming the air in bold defiance of the vacuum outside. The youth of the Dominion, Jaran, human, and those born of both, gathered beneath canopies of living green. They spoke a hybrid tongue, told jokes the old generation would never understand, their laughter proof that adaptation was not just possible, but beautiful. Mason wore the torque with pride, its band gleaming dark and smooth above the hollow of his throat. It was no longer a mark of bondage or subjugation. It had become a sigil of chosen loyalty, of a rule shared in public and in private. He walked the palace with a calm authority, greeting the young with gentle questions and the old with a warrior's respect. The legend of his arrival, the human who had survived the Colosseum, who had outwitted traitors and won the Empress's heart, had grown in the telling, but he wore that myth lightly. His strength now lay in the wisdom he brought to the council and the courage with which he met every new test. Lyrael ruled beside him, her violet eyes taking in the world with a gaze both piercing and kind. Her authority was undiminished, her voice still the one that quieted storms and ended debates. But Mason's perspective had shaped her, softened the sharpest edges, given her a vision that stretched beyond Jaran's stars. Her reign was marked by empathy that surprised the old guard and inspired the young. Together, they forged peace from the raw metal of old rivalries. In the council chamber, they settled disputes between houses with a blend of Jaran tradition and Terran practicality. Lyrael would listen, letting the nobles speak their grievances, and then turn to Mason, who would see through the posturing to the heart of the matter. "You fear loss," he would say, or, "You cling to what was, but you must ask what could be." Sometimes the nobles left grumbling, but more often they left with the sense that the future could belong to them, too. Disputes once destined for violence now ended in compromise. Mason's human stubbornness was matched by Lyrael's royal resolve. They negotiated with the Turnus coalition, brokered an alliance that brought prosperity to the Halos system. The chronicles would remember not a tale of a human broken by an empire, but of an empire transformed by a human's indomitable will, and an empress wise enough to welcome it. The palace itself bore the marks of their union. The council chamber's mural now depicted not only the Jaran victories, but the forging of a new peace. Portraits of past rulers were joined by an image of Lyrael and Mason, side by side beneath a sky filled with Jaran and Terran constellations entwined. In the privacy of their chambers, passion endured. Where once their nights had been wild and desperate, a contest for dominance, a surrender to need, now their love was profound, enduring. The air in their suite shimmered with quiet music and the scent of blooming vines. They shared stories of childhood, dreams for their child's future, and plans for a dominion that would one day belong to many, not just one. Some nights, Mason would lie awake, watching Lyrael as she slept, her hair silvered by the starlight pouring through the window. He would trace the line of her jaw with gentle fingers, marveling at the journey that had brought him from a shattered warship to this quiet room, to a love fierce enough to reshape an empire. Other nights, they would talk late into the darkness. Mason would recall Earth, its blue skies, its simple joys, and Lyrael would share the legends of her people, stories of the first Empress and the ancient wandering stars. Their differences became a tapestry, each thread brightening the whole. Their power play had become a dance, not a duel. Lyrael would tease him, her laughter echoing through the halls. Mason would challenge her, never letting her forget that even an empress could be surprised. They spoke of legacy, not just for their own child, but for every citizen who now believed that the future could be more than inheritance and battle. One evening, as dusk painted the sky with magenta and gold, Lyrael looked at Mason, her violet eyes bright. They stood on the balcony, watching the city pulse with life, the mixed voices of Terran and Jaran children rising in song below. "Does the torque ever feel heavy?" she asked quietly, her fingers brushing the metal at his throat. He smiled, drawing her close. "Only when you're not beside me," he replied, the words both a confession and a vow. He pulled her into a kiss, gentle at first, then deepening, their bodies fitting together with the comfort of years. It was not the kiss of conquest or desperation, but of trust, of having built something lasting. Their love was no longer a scandal whispered behind hands in shadowed halls. It was the cornerstone of a new dynasty, a legend recounted in schools and sung in the taverns of distant moons. It was hope, made flesh. In the starlit quiet, with the universe spinning endlessly beyond their window, they lay entwined, Empress and champion, partners in rule and life. Mason's hand rested on Lyrael's abdomen, feeling the steady promise of the future beneath his palm. The torque, once a tool of domination, now glowed softly, the light reflecting in both their eyes, a symbol of a bond stronger than any chain. As they faced the future together, Lyrael and Mason knew the Dominion would be shaped not by fear or tradition, but by the choices they made, the love they shared, and the unbreakable connection they had forged. Not of metal, but of trust, courage, and a shared destiny among the stars.